Greetings and welcome back to the Shift Briefing Series. I'm David Pearson. It's been a while since we chatted, and there's a lot that's gone on in law enforcement with COVID and some of the protests, and I'm hopeful that you and yours are safe and healthy. In this video, I want to talk about three concepts and how they relate to welfare checks and responding to suicidal subjects, and they also have a little bit of tie-in to other work that we do in law enforcement. And those three concepts are going to be the Community Care Doctrine, Emergency Aid Doctrine, and Exigent Circumstances. Let's get started. As I've gone around the country and talked to different people about responding to suicidal subjects, we always get into this conversation of our duty and what we need to do to help other people out. And so I wanted to do a quick video on the community care, emergency aid, and exigent circumstances, because each of those concepts kind of play into this response that we have to these different calls. The first one I want to talk about is, and remember, to start off with, I'm not a lawyer, but I think I kind of understand these concepts well enough to have a quick conversation with you about kind of, how we should apply that on the street. But if you're uncomfortable with taking my word for it, please reach out and talk to your legal experts in your area. So the first one I want to talk about is Community Care Doctrine. Now, the law understands, and depending on the court cases, and there's plenty of them out there that refer to the Community Care Doctrine. They talk about this understanding that law enforcement has other duties besides just the enforcement of law. And one of those is the care for the community. And so what we mean by that is that we're going to do things that fall outside of our normal job, but are for the benefit of the community. Let me give you a couple of examples. So if you have some sort of natural disaster, a flood or a fire that comes through your jurisdiction, you're going to be doing things simply for the care of the community that don't involve any enforcement of the law activities. And normally we talk about community care with our ability to exercise some level of authority, like getting into somebody's house. So let's say that you've had some sort of flood or other natural disaster come through your community. You're now going through and checking the area where that particular event occurred, and you're knocking on doors and potentially making entry into houses just to make sure that there's nobody that's inside that is a victim of some sort of injury or something like that. You know what I'm saying? So your ability to get in that house has nothing to do with the law side of that, if you will. I mean, you're not doing that for any sort of enforcement. You're just doing that as a community care act. If you ever have something in the back of your mind that clicks in and says, I wonder if I can find dope or money or drugs or something like that, then you probably shouldn't be referring to any of your activities in terms of the Community Care Doctrine. So as you come on a house that might have been impacted by the flood, we often will make entry into those homes to make sure that everybody's okay. And so that's totally okay, and that's what the Community Care Doctrine is about. But let's assume that we have, Joe, the rag man that's on the other side of the city, and his home is not impacted by the flood. And you say to yourself, I wonder if I can use community care to get into his house and look for his dope. Well, obviously, you know that that's not going to be able to be done. So we want to make sure that we're not fudging our way by using some of these other doctrines when we should be doing some really good police work and developing some probable cause on our own. So let's take community care out on the road with us. You're driving down the road and it's in the middle of the day and you see a car, it's on the other side of the road, they have their flashers on, and as you're approaching them, you're like, well, I wonder if they're okay or not. As you drive by, because it's daylight, you can see the person talking on the phone. They're out of traffic, they're not any kind of a hazard or anything, and you can see them laughing and they're talking on the phone. Well, now all of a sudden you know that they're okay. So your community care interest in that person is immediately over. As soon as you say, oh, they seem to be okay, then community care ends. let's take that same stretch of road. Maybe it's 2 o'clock in the morning and their hazards are on. And they're in the same place. They're off of the road, but they're pulled over to the side. But you can't see into the car because it's dark. And you think to yourself, well, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. I wonder if they are okay. Well, now you turn around, you approach the car, and your interest in that car at that particular moment is a community care. What if they broke down? What if they need some sort of assistance? And you're okay to go ahead and initiate some sort of contact based on a community care. Let's say it's that 2 o'clock in the morning thing, you've spun your car around, and as you're pulling up, somebody reaches their hand out and kind of waves at you, kind of signaling, hey, I'm okay, and they take off and go. Well, now all of a sudden you know that they're okay, their car's working, so your community care interest in that car kind of has to stop. But let's say you've already turned around and you're driving down the road and you follow them for a little bit because there's really no other place to go at 2 o'clock in the morning, and you start to see signs of impairment. They're going over the line, or they're sweaving, as my friend would say, and doing a bunch of things that would now cause an interest in some sort of impairment. Now you click into law enforcement mode. Now your contact of that vehicle is no longer in the community care arena. It's more in the probable cause or reasonable suspicion that the person might be impaired. And so you take police action from there. And that kind of is community care. The next concept that we want to talk about is the emergency aid doctrine. Now, this doctrine is used by a lot of people to make entry into a home, whether it's forced or you're just turning the doorknob, to go in and check on somebody and render aid. Now, the courts understand, and of course this is probably not in your jurisdiction, but this does occur around the country where officers will use this to make an entry when they're really kind of stretching the truth, to say the least. So the courts have written some fairly specific language, and in there they talk about approximating probable cause when somebody is articulating their reasons behind this. So to kind of help reduce some of the likelihood of misuse, there's a three-pronged test for this, and again, your reasons need to be approximating probable cause. The first prong on this test is that you can speak to an immediate crisis and the need for help, and the fact that your help, that your aid will be helpful. The second thing that, the second prong of that is that your primary purpose for making that entry is to render aid. And the third part of that is that the location that you're about to enter, approximating probable cause, is known to you to be the place where that person's at. The other part of that is they talk about this whole idea of some sort of significant injury. And so if you're looking through the window and you see somebody with a cut on their finger and they're getting ready to put a Band-Aid on it, that doesn't mean you can kick the door to go and provide aid on some minor injury. So just be very, very careful about your use of the emergency aid doctrine. The next concept that we talk about is exigent circumstances. And it's important to understand that oftentimes officers roll that emergency aid doctrine into exigent circumstances. And in fact, the court, and I believe it's in 2011, actually included emergency aid doctrine under exigent circumstances. Because for a long time, exigent circumstances was simply a criminal construct. In other words, the protection of life, protection of evidence, preventing escape, or the ability for somebody to hurt law enforcement. That has given you the right or the ability to enter a home without a search warrant or consent. Because as we know, those are the three things that'll get you into a house: consent, exigent circumstances, or a search warrant. But oftentimes we use exigent circumstances as this broad brush to give us that ability to make entry. So it's important that we kind of are really clear on those things. And as we talked about, if you're not going to go in to protect a life or protect evidence or prevent some level of escape or injury to yourself, and you're relying on emergency aid doctrine under exigent circumstances, you have to go back and articulate that three-pronged test for emergency aid. I guess I wouldn't be much of a YouTuber if I didn't ask you to hit that subscribe button and the like button, and then add any comments that you might have about the video or other topics that you'd like me to discuss. So let's talk a little bit about using these concepts and applying them to a welfare check or a response to suicidal subject. So most of us in law enforcement, you've been on cop for longer than 6 minutes, you know we go on a lot of these calls. So the normal call is I haven't heard from someone, enter the name and the relationship and the reasons why they haven't been heard from. Most of us as police officers, using the Community Care Doctrine, we're going to go over and check their welfare. Now, that welfare, that Community Care Doctrine stops at the front door. So we get over there, we kind of check the place out, we might knock on the door, we might look through some windows. But absent some other issue, and again, we don't have a natural disaster coming through, so that we can't use that. So our interest in that home stops there. If it's a daughter that's in college that hasn't been heard from, well, there's a lot of things that could happen. They might be off with some friends up in the mountains or doing whatever. So we can't artificially make up this worst case scenario to break into the house. Remember, our emergency aid doctrine requires verbiage that approximate probable cause, not a hunch in the back of your head. Now, it's completely different if you show up and there's a broken window and it looks like somebody has busted into the house. Now you got some completely different thing. So let's say you show up to a father or a grandmother or somebody that's been in the hospital, had some sort of procedure, suffered a stroke or whatever, and you show up and their car's in the driveway and there's papers that are stacked out, then now you're starting to add up those reasons why you might invoke the emergency aid doctrine and make entry. But that really is kind of up to you to decide on whether or not it reaches that. I mean, every call that I've gone on, there's this tick back and forth of the balance scale, and when it kind of gets up to this point, then I'm going to do those things. So the next part that we talk about is a welfare check with the word suicidal in it. Anytime that you hear the word suicidal, there's a completely different game plan that you need to do. It's no longer the average welfare check where you can put the Community Care Doctrine in there. So when you show up to a home, and we've talked about that in the response to suicidal subject video, so I'm not going to hit that again. But remember, a lot of people are throwing that exigent circumstances or emergency aid doctrine as the reason that they make entry into the home. And I think it's not accurately applied in those circumstances. So I want you to be really, really careful as you do that. So hopefully the discussion of these three concepts, along with watching the response to suicidal subject video, will help clear up your response options on both a welfare check and a suicidal subject. I want you to take care of yourselves out there. This is a really interesting time for law enforcement. As Dick Winters, the Easy Company commander, would say, hang tough. And until our next video, please be smart, be safe, and be efficient. Take care.